Democracy is a government for the people, by the people, of the people. Ladies and gentlemen, with this quote by Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, welcome the first time from such proposition to today's debate on the motion, this House believes that a parliamentary democracy requires the inclusion of sovereign referenda to decide on important issues. I'm the first speaker, and today I'm just going to give you our definition, our case, our timeline, and after that I'll answer the speech. So let me first start off with our definition. We define parliamentary democracy as a political system with the government as a legislative body. The parliament gets elected by the people, directly or indirectly, and the ministers are accountable and not only in the head of the government but also to the parliament as well. We define important issues as topics affecting huge parts of the society, for example, constitutional changes, taxes, war decisions, territorial referenda, and big infrastructure buildings such as airports and so on. So let me now come to the case. What we see is that in a parliamentary democracy, the for and by, what I spoke about in my introduction, sadly gets ignored very often. And therefore, we are going to show you that a parliamentary democracy is in need of plebiscites to sustain the fundamental value of democracy, the political satisfaction, the accountability, and the political participation. So I'm going to show you why the direct participation is so important to secure the fundamental values of democracy, and why it is a tool to enhance the political satisfaction. My second speaker is going to talk about the accountability and the political participation. So let me now start with my own substantive speech. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the fundamental value of democracy is actually that you have a say. You have a say to decide on the topics that are affecting you, and mainly on the very important topics, as I've already stated in our definition. But what we see is that proposition is that sometimes we need representative indirect elements to make the government work. But what we also see is the problematic behind it when the other people are voting for you, ladies and gentlemen. Because everybody can represent himself best. Nobody can represent me as good as I can, because I'm the only one that knows exactly what I want to vote for and what I stand for. So therefore the legislative body can't represent your opinion on every level, because they always get influenced through other factors and subjective feelings, as for example lobbyism, but my second speaker will further elaborate this point. Well, my second point is that most legislative bodies are elected regional, but actually they decide on a national level, which means that you have a region and they vote for somebody, but then in fact he makes decisions later when he's in the parliament that is affecting the whole state. So he speaks for and votes for more people than actually the people that were voting for him, and therefore he represents the whole population, but he actually can't, because he's not being elected by the whole population. Well, lastly, we see... Yes, please.
So to think that by he being there, he's representing the area in which he was chosen?
Of course he represents the area in which he was chosen, but what you have to think about is whether it's not better if you're representing yourself mainly on the important decisions, ladies and gentlemen, because if you have somebody representing you in the government who gets influence, as I've already stated, or as my second speaker is going to say also, and also if you're voting yourself and you don't vote somebody who's representing you, actually the political satisfaction is raising, since you see that you can that you get included and that you can actively change something. But I'm going to talk about this later in my speech. So lastly, representative is the one that decides on the topic, and you have actually no guarantee that he's going to vote in your favor. Because take the USA, the United States, and with the Vietnam War as an example, ladies and gentlemen, 70% of the population were actually against this war, but no party was there that offered that interest, because they were influenced by other factors, because they were so focused on the anti-communism that they actually kind of lost track and lost focus on what is good for their population and what's the best for the United States. So the people living in the United States, they had to fight the war. No, thank you. They had to fight the war, even though 70% of the population weren't really behind it and weren't supporting this war. So what we see is that plebiscites are necessary to preserve the fundamental values of democracy, and therefore we should, no thank you, we should introduce them on the very important issues. Well, this actually leads me directly to my second point, the political satisfaction, because we see a problem if you only have the possibility like all 4 years to vote once, and then you have a person representing you for 4 years, and actually it can come down to that you votes for things and decides on things that you actually don't want him to do, so you're unsatisfied with what he's doing. But if the people are able to decide themselves on different topics, then their decision is based on their responsibility. So if then something goes wrong, let's say they afterwards they see that what they voted for actually wasn't really what they planned, like the decision has a different outcome than it was expected, then they can't blame the government for the misleading decisions, because they were actually the ones that were deciding to do this, and they are the ones that are responsible for it. But what we also see is, if they are responsible for it, on the other hand, they also see that they are actually actively involved more in politics. They are able to decide on their own and vote on their own for their interests, and they see that they actually have a say in politics, and that they have the possibility to directly change somebody, to directly influence what is happening in politics. So what we see is, therefore, he gets more satisfied. And obviously, if we have a more satisfied population, this can only have positive effects on our society. So what we see is that by introducing sovereign referenda on important issues, we actually increase the voter satisfaction, and therefore create benefits for the society through this. For example, you could take the era in Germany, when we had this 1986 movement. The people there were unsatisfied with the political situation because they thought that they weren't able to actively change something and influencing what was happening in politics. And ladies and gentlemen, we all know how this ended. They actually had terrorist attacks. They had riots, and this all had a very bad outcome. So, and the only problem there was that people had the feeling that they can't change anything in politics, and that the government doesn't really care for what they think is good. The second point is, what you can also take, for example, when in Germany the euro was first implemented, then in other parts of the European Union, they asked, for example, in Austria or in Switzerland, the population had the possibility to do the plebiscites and decide actually whether they wanted to have the euro or not. But in Germany, we didn't have the possibility. And every time, and now when we have a problem with the euro, like for example now with the financial crisis and the financial problems with Greece and so on, we always, the morning begins, and all the people say that actually it isn't their responsibility, because they never get the chance to really decide this, but the government did. So what we see is that through making those sovereign referenda, through implementing those sovereign referenda on important issues, we are on the one hand creating a satisfied population, and on the other hand, the people get the chance to actually actively change something in politics. So therefore, please vote positive. Thank you.
Minutes and 40 seconds.
Yeah.
All right. Speech now. I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me remind you our motion today. This House believes that a parliamentary democracy requires the inclusion of sovereign referenda to decide on important issues. I'm the first speaker of the opposition team, and we think that this is not a necessity. First of all, let me give you a little rebuttal of what the opposition just said. First of all, they didn't declare any problem, so why should we change the status quo if there's no problem with the actual system? Let me tell you that parliamentary democracy just as it is right now, has no major problems. The actual problem is that implementing this system brings many problems and an unworthy cost. So, why change the status quo? Let's just let the parliamentary democracy work as it is right now and not include sovereign referenda as the proposition says. We will understand this case taking into consideration all of the factors that this system implies, in the short vision and in the long term, and the effects that it might have, showing all of the negative aspects and the main flaws that it has. Let me tell you that this debate is about 1. A system full of flaws that is including the sovereign referenda, and versus a system that works nowadays in the current reality. Yes?
We have here several examples where we show you that the system doesn't work. For example, in the USA, where for 5 years, young men had to go fight a war they never proposed and they never stand for.
First of all, USA is not a parliamentary democracy, so it doesn't stand. And we're talking about parliamentary democracy here. Okay, now going to my rebuttal. You said too many things. First, direct participation, and that you can represent yourself better than anyone. So why do we choose representatives? Because really, in a democracy, it's the system nowadays, and the only way to make things work is by choosing someone that represents you. Even though you know what, even though you may think, no thank you, that you know what is best, there's a reason why we choose representatives. You also said that politics may vote for their own good, for their own satisfaction, but this is not quite true. Yes, this may happen in some places.
Oh, again.
Let me finish. In some places, but there is a reason why these representatives got elected. There is a reason why people trust them and in their government, yes?
Did you ever hear of lobbyism and the influence that other companies and people and politicians have on other politicians, and therefore they vote in the interest of their, for example, economic interest, and not really in the interest of the people themselves?
Well, this would create social discontent, which clearly is not what politicians look for. And even though, yes, there are some extreme cases where this has happened, there's no reason why it would happen in every single case. So, not because... No, thank you. Not because some places happen, we will do it for every single country. Also, you never stated a mechanism, and please tell me, how would you make this work? How would you make this only be for important issues, as the motion says?
Yeah.
No, thank you. How would you prevent to pay all this enormous money that making a referenda implies? You never said how would you make this work. So now, as I go into my case, I divided our case into 2 main splits. First of all, the negative effects that this may bring, which I will develop, and secondly, the practical one and how the parliamentary is already stable. Now going to the negative effects, we have 3 points. First, long-term vision versus circumstantial majorities. Citizens who vote in these important issues are not as qualified as the politicians and as the experts. No, thank you. And as the experts that help politicians take these decisions. Citizens may be affected by propaganda or the sporadic situation. No, thank you. Or the sporadic situation that you're living right now, but only experts and people that know about these issues look at the long-term vision. They know that maybe in 10 years this won't work, or this matter. No, thank you. And that this law may have flaws or everything. So this is why these important issues that the motion talks about should be taken wisely, with time, not with a simple yes or no answer. Actually, Professor Turney from the University of Edinburgh supports this by saying that elected representatives bring expertise and time to problems that ordinary citizens don't have. They see the bigger picture. That is why, no thank you, we choose representatives to decide on these issues for us. It's because they have more qualities or more expertise and more time to decide on these issues. Now going to the second point, the lack of participation. studies have shown that people lack interest to participate in referendums.
Madam,
No, thank you. Results don't represent the majority's opinion, and this gives no true representation to the regular citizen. I have an example for this. In London, only 34% of the citizens voted in the referenda that asked, do you want a major for London? 72% no thank you, answered yes, and 28% answered no. But 66% of Londoners didn't vote at all. So this is clearly a low turnout, and that favored, of course, the supporters of the major. So why, no thank you, spend these huge amounts of money that, let me tell you, it's almost as expensive as a regular election, a presidential election. Why spend these huge amounts of money for only 34% of the people go vote? It's not worth all of that cost. And besides, not every country has this huge amount of money to ask this yes or no question. And this is what I'm going to talk about in my third area. By making sovereign referendums, you're oversimplifying complex issues. We're talking about important matters, as the motion says, reduced to a yes or no question. No, thank you. You can't ask for a specific opinion for every citizen. You just can ask for a yes or no. This is a major risk because you're turning an issue of relevance that may have major consequences into a simple answer. Important issues should be analyzed by people with experience and time, dedicating consideration and dedicating time and considering other factors and other implications. This is why we choose our representatives, because they can have the time and the expertise to choose the right decision. What I have showed in my speech is why there are a lot of negative effects by making a sovereign referendum. There's low participation. It's a huge cost for the country, and when people don't actually vote, and why, by making a yes or no answer, you're oversimplifying important issues. For all of this, and because we think that sovereign referenda is not necessary in a parliamentary democracy, I beg the judges to oppose.
thank you for your speech. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister from the Council side.
We found it rather funny that they accepted our definition in their first debate, and then she came up with the fact that, well, no, in fact, the United States doesn't fall under a parliamentary democracy with our definition, and in fact that, well, how are we going to impose this as a whole? Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, let me show you throughout my rebuttal and throughout my speech, point out why, in fact, they accepted our definition and how the United States does fall under this. And furthermore, move on to the points that she failed to actually show why it would be such a burden onto the society if we would have these sovereign referenda. And then I'll move on to my own substantive speech, which is split up into A, the accountability, and B, the political participation that we will reach through the sovereign referenda. She clearly stated at the beginning that we didn't find a problem. In my first speaker spent her entire speech on actually showing what social uprisings can cause because of the fact that the people are not represented by their governments. We see that in fact when a region has voted a representative that in fact doesn't represent what this actual region wants, for example, then the people do in fact uprise and start and come to protest. And we see that in fact, dear opposition, if that's what you want me to find a problem with, that in fact is a problem. We see that if the people are not being represented correctly, then we define that as once again a problem in our society. Because what is a democracy about? It's about representing what the people want. And the people are the ones who have to decide on this. Furthermore, they stated, well, the USA doesn't fall under our parliamentary democracy definition, but she accepted it. We said it's a political system with a government as a legislative body, and which means it has, like somewhat the United States has a House of Representatives or a House of Senates. So we see that once in fact, but through our definition, that the United States does in fact fall under this. Furthermore, we see that important issues we need to find out are such as constitutional changes, taxes, war decisions, and your opposition, if you want, you can write that down, territorial referenda, and so on. We see that we have to define this clearly and show you what all we're going to decide on and what not, because we see that these important issues are the issues that directly affect the society, and the people as a whole. So therefore we see that those are the issues that we should place a sovereign referenda on when they're going to be changed, and so on. Leading on to her main point, which was the fact that the people are not qualified to decide as the representatives. We said that in fact in a democracy, it's not necessarily about who's qualified or not to make decisions. We would much rather see that if a citizen is affected by some kind of constitutional change, a tax or reward decision, then we see that it is, so the representative, like take for example, in the United States with the Vietnam War, the representative had a good word, but also did the person. So we see that it affects the representative just as much as the person, so therefore we say the person, the member of society, or the citizen, should in fact have the same as much right to decide on these important issues as a whole. We see that they may know more or less about it, but I'll talk about later in my political participation and how that works. But we see that in fact they should have that right to decide on things when it comes to important issues that affect them directly. Moving on to the economic burden that they put on that. We see an economic burden, and because the state cannot manage their money, is in fact an inner problem. It has nothing to do whether people should not have the right to decide on these important issues. We see that as work, for example, in Switzerland, and we see that in fact by putting up a sovereign referendum, you in fact are including the people, and the people in fact like that. Furthermore, she stated that because they have a low turnout, it would be simply ridiculous to impose these, to implement these sovereign referendums. What we see, in fact, is that the parliament vote in Europe also only has about a 45 to 55% turnout. Is that too low for you, dear opposition? Should we just cancel out the parliament vote because there's not enough people voting for that? We see that, in fact, no. We see that we should, in fact, vote on these things because the parliament directly also affects the decisions that the parliament makes do also affect the people. And we see that because the fact that you do not have many people voting for a sovereign referendum doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't give the people the chance to vote for things that affect them directly. We're talking about the principles of democracy, which my first speaker elaborated further in her speech, and we see that these principles need, in fact, to be preserved. Further on in her last point, which was simplifying the issues, she said that, in fact, when it comes up to a simple yes or no, and people decide on that. Well, in fact, on the main issues, such as constitutional changes or taxes or war decisions, it is in fact a simple yes or no. Should we go to war? Yes or no? We see that we're not simplifying the issues here. We're saying that, I'll elaborate furthermore on political participation at that point, but we're saying that the people can inform themselves, know about what's going on, and they're forced to decide themselves. We see that, in fact, it isn't feasible, as we've seen it done in countries, also such as Germany. We've had plebiscites in Germany as well. Moving on to my own substantive speech, which is split up into accountability and the political participation. Okay, so what we see here is that if people vote, if they're allowed to vote on these sovereign referenda, then they trust their government more, which means that the government, in fact, basically gives this right to the people, and therefore the people feel as if the government are actually working for them. Furthermore, the government has to, in fact, rely on the people's opinion and their tendencies to gain the votes that are for his side. Therefore, we see that they're more controlled by population, and therefore we see that, once again, the true value of democracy is implemented because, in fact, the government must rely on the population and must work with the population, which is exactly what democracy stands for. Moving on to the second part of this argument, which is lobbyism. As we've seen, especially in Europe, lobbyism is based on representative democracy. Why? Because these lobbyists, these legislative bodies, are influenced through, let's say, pharmacy industries, energy enterprises, and so on, such as Nestle, Sony, and so on. We see that these lobbyists, in fact, lobby to get the representatives to vote in their favor. We see is that through plebiscites, they lose influence on the politicians because the representatives have the same vote as each and every person that is voting in the sovereign referendum. So we see that they're depending on the population, and therefore, once again, as a democracy, they can represent what the population actually wants. They're less deterrent to vote in the lobbyist interest. For example, let's take a look at Hungary, what happened. They had constitutional changes that were made without referenda. What they changed was, in fact, the presidency of 4 to 6 years. There were social uprisings through that, so we clearly identify a problem with that. We see, in fact, it's not the population's interest in that, and it was that clearly is a problem to your opposition, and we see that we must address this problem. To conclude this part, we see that the true values are promoted, and the people's trust, is in fact gained by the government. We see that there's less lobbyism and more including population. Furthermore, we see that the people participate more when they're more interested when it comes to these important topics. Why? Because they're directly affected. And why? Because they actually have a voice and a say. And that's exactly what we're standing for here today. Give an example. We had in Stuttgart, Germany, there was a new train station that was supposed to be built. And we had social uprisings because, in fact, the Green Party and the people who were supporting the Green Party did not accept this because there was about 4 to 7 billion euros being spent on that. Then we had a social referenda, and the outcome was that the population, in fact, decided to build this train station because they saw that it was, in fact, better than for the infrastructure. What we see here is that people are perfectly capable of choosing whether or not they want. As my first speaker said, people are capable of in fact, representing themselves the best. So, ladies and gentlemen, to gain the trust, to support the values of democracy, to enforce less lobbyism and include the people in the population, to gain more political participation, you must vote for Prop. Thank you.
Next speech now, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Good afternoon. We are here deciding whether or not we should implement a federal referenda for all parliamentary democratic countries. I will begin by reviewing what the proposition team had said, and I will later develop our team's last few arguments. I will begin by reviewing. We heard from the other team that you need to have a say in your country. But we believe that people do have a say when they choose their representatives, when they choose who will take decisions for them. We also heard examples from the United States, which we want to say it's not a parliamentary democracy. And by the terms they mentioned, it's actually, we all know what a parliamentary democracy is, and it's not what that term said. So we believe that is a totally narrow case, which doesn't allow this debate to continue. You said that the sovereign referendum will bring social happiness to everyone. But in the arguments I will develop later, this will show that this may bring really bad effects. For example, a political crisis. You also said that Germans say they're not responsible for the decisions they take to the euro, but they actually are. They are the ones who chose their representatives, the people who took these decisions. So they were responsible for voting for that. Later we heard that democracy is made to people decide, and as I just said before, people are deciding. They are deciding who is taking the decisions for them. No, thank you. You also said that they don't care that the parliamentarians are informed of the thing they are deciding, and that it doesn't matter that people doesn't know. But how are they going to vote correctly if they don't know what's really happening, if they don't know all the information of what's there? Parliamentarians have time and have money. One second. Parliamentarians have time and money to do these investigations. While people, they may be at work, but they not have time to do so to get as informed as parliamentarians may get.
In order for the government to gain the votes of the people that enforce their side, they're forced to inform the people. And the people, if they have the decision, they're not stupid. They're going to inform themselves before they make their decisions.
I've never said they're stupid. They go through education. They went to school. Maybe they went to university. But they're not as informed as someone may get in every specific thing of subject of our life. There are a lot of different subjects that they may know the basic things, but they don't know the real truth, the profundity and what's really happening. Nothing. You also said that it doesn't matter if a lot of people doesn't vote, if there's little representation there. But if you want people to choose, how are you going to do it if there's no people? But in the example we gave, less than the half of the people who should have voted. So, and on a second point, it's actually a really big cost for the government or for the person or for the institution who is doing this referendum to do this, all the campaign, all the places where you should do this, to have a little amount of people doing this and not being a real representation. Yes?
To your last point, actually, when you when you have the people that aren't coming to the votes, we see the same with normal parliamentary votes where you vote for representatives. So would you like kind of abolish democracy at all because the people don't come to vote?
Okay, thank you. Well, actually, parliamentary democracy, there is a limit of what percentage must be there for that decision to be taken. Instead of referendums, there's no way to do this. You haven't established a mechanism, or we haven't heard a clear one, which would say who would make these referendums, how this would be controlled, how many people must vote for this referendum to be valid. So we have to hear, no thank you, so we have to hear these things that are really useful for this thing to happen. You are pointing out specific countries who have had problems with their referendums, who have had manifestations, but other countries throughout the world make really important decisions really commonly. And it's not like we have people every single day for every single single subject manifesting in the country. There are a lot of decisions that are well taken and not necessarily have a bad response. I'll now go to our team's two last arguments, which are the stability of the parliamentary democracy and the controlled participation. Going to the third argument of our team, and my first one. There's a basic principle for parliamentary democracy, that the sovereignty is in the parliament. They decide the laws, they decide the prime minister, so they are actually deciding what would actually happen in the country. No, thank you. But these parliaments are not just, they say they want to be a parliamentarian. They are chosen by people. People chose them because they know what they do and because they think they'll do the best for them. No, thank you. By giving the people the power, the parliament's power would be undermined. They will lose all these faculties they have given from the essence of parliamentary democracy. And actually, this democracy would actually go to the people, not being a parliamentary democracy at all. This is no thank you. This is a system that had worked for years, and we don't see really big problems nowadays. That's why a lot of countries apply this. This would go against this, as I said, against this system stability, and may bring to really bad consequences as a political crisis. Because the government wouldn't be able to control all this situation because they have no power at all. No, thank you. But let me ask you a question. If people vote one way and the parliament votes the other way, it's a sovereign referendum, so that the referendum would be the sovereign one. So it would be people's decision here. The parliament's decisions are null now. They don't exist. So you're taking the power of the parliament and giving it to the people, who may not be as informed as the parliamentarians are. Going to the second argument, the controlled participation. There are chances that the referendums will only happen when the government thinks that they will win or that the answer will be convenient for them. There's no way to control how many referendums are held and if they actually are doing it for this reason. An example of this is Tony Blair, an ex-British Prime Minister. He got to 2 referendums for his campaign because he thought these things may be controversial in this campaign. He did it for his convenience so he may win. Another thing of this is Uruguay. Yes, this is not a parliamentary democracy, but an example of a referendum. They implemented this referendum 15 years ago, and little amount of them have been done. That proves that the government uses not only when they think they're going to win, and even otherwise. There can be an abuse of these referendums, which may bring to bad consequences and being the government's decisions. For example, Italy. They made 4 referendums in just a year. With the arguments I developed, I showed you why it's not correct to take all these referendums, and we shouldn't do it. Because of this, we make 2 of those.
ladies and gentlemen, what we saw today on side opposition was this assumption of stability, meaning that actually every citizen taking part in a civil referendum is just stupid and isn't capable of actually voting the right way. So what we see is that actually the democracy and the fundamental value, as first again pointed out in her quote of Abraham Lincoln, a government by the people, for the people, from the people, that every citizen has the duty to inform itself before it's going to vote. And we went now for two speeches, for the two substantive speeches from side opposition, to answer one little question. How can a citizen which isn't capable of voting on an important issue, which isn't capable of informing himself for a referendum, how is that citizen capable of voting the experts and their parliamentarians? Because we have different tendencies in this parliament. And what we see is this little question. If they would have been capable of answering that, ladies and gentlemen, we would have made, for example, me as third speaker outside the problem much easier. But well, ladies and gentlemen, let me come to my two main areas of rebellion in which I detail just will destroy the opposition's case. The first one is about the main argumentation on the effects of society or the effects on politics, and secondly, the first area of rebellion is about that weird definition clash. I'm really sorry. And secondly, I'm going to deal with the effects on society. I'm sorry. So, ladies and gentlemen, that definition class was, first I have to say, they just actually attacked our definition in their second speech, therefore it's a bit late, but well, even though they would have done that. What we see is, in defending our definition of a parliamentary democracy, we see that this actually shouldn't, in that debate, we shouldn't just focus on any fixed defined words and fixed defined quotients like parliamentary democracy. We should just debate on a higher level, on an abstract level, on a theoretical level. And we just said to you that we want a democracy where a parliament is in, just by elaborating a democracy which is representative, where we vote legislative bodies in a parliament. Even though, for example, the United States would be a presidential democracy, we see that they still have the system of a representative democracy, and we are actually today debating or fighting for a party directed democracies inside opposition and a representative democracy inside opposition. So, but even though, ladies and gentlemen, well, I just can't repeat myself, what we see is that the whole definition clash is actually clashing one of our examples about the United States. Even though we'd accept their definition of a parliamentary democracy, we gave you several other examples, like for example Germany, like for example the European Union, where we have so many countries where we're talking exclusively about also in their definition parliamentary democracies. So what we see is that even our examples of our substantive speeches are still standing. So after I dealt with that, somehow just nearly ridiculous definition class. Let's come to my second main area of rebuttal, the effects in society. During this debate, no thank you, ma'am, I actually just asked myself two major questions. The first one is, are citizens capable of voting on issues or just capable of voting parliamentary bodies? And secondly, does the political participation in our system actually decrease later? So let me start with the first question of that area of rebuttal. Are citizens capable of voting on important issues? Ladies and gentlemen, so what we see is that every person at first, of course, has to, that every person in a democracy has the duty to inform himself. And I just can repeat my introduction, ladies and gentlemen, in assumption of stupidity, they just missed one major point. We see that if we would see the general problem in society that people don't inform themselves, they never show us how they, in their model, actually implement systems, how they will actually just further foster the political education and further enhance that education. Because what we see, if somebody is not capable of doing one little decision, he also shouldn't be capable of electing a politician which is now for 4 years at least in office and can just do decisions for 4 years. So what we see is if you just, even though you might miss, for example, one election, this harm is just much smaller than you would just, for example, be miseducated for one politician, which you actually depending on the country for 4 to 6 years. He could just, for example, like we saw the example of Dorban in Hungary, where he just can do so much more actually negative or harms to the society, ladies and gentlemen. And to that point, they actually also, at that point, an important issues to our referendum, where they also try to clash our model, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry that I just where they try to clash our model, what we see is that I just can currently repeat myself, people are capable of voting on these important issues because they have to inform themselves all the time, and we define important issues clearly in our first speech for topics which have huge impacts on the society, and we get several examples like war, like constitutional changes, etc., etc. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the end, what we see is that as long as they can present us a side opposition where actually the political education will grow, we just have the same general problem in our society, and it's not mutually exclusive. That side proposition also will implement several systems or campaigns to actually enhance and further foster the political education, ladies and gentlemen. So let me come to my second question I ask myself. Does the political participation actually decrease? And I'm just going to answer you clearly no. At first, the analysis of side opposition in this case was pretty just naive. It just said, so we have different studies, and we have one example with the mayor of London. This is like just one small city, as long as we debate about an issue which is defined on all parliamentary democracies worldwide. And secondly, what we see is not a real analysis if you just focus on that there are certain studies which prove that. And I can assure you, I can find for any topic I like, for any position, certain studies which will prove that. Yes, please.
If you're giving people the capacity to decide, will the parliament be taking the same amount of decisions as before? If you're giving the capacity to people to decide, will the parliament be having the same power, taking the same amount of decisions as before?
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is actually what we want. So this is, but I will come to that further in that question. So, first, shortly. So what we see, as I just told you, as in the second screen, we see a general problem that we have low political participation, as well in the representative democracies, and we have that also in direct democracies. So we see in the European Parliament elections we had bad turnouts, and this is a problem we have also to fight with other systems, but this is actually not the motion we should debate about. And secondly, we showed you clearly that in our system, what we saw is that the political participation will grow because of the direct democracy, because of the interest which will grow if you have just the power to decide on certain topics, ladies and gentlemen. And to the point of that if you just take the power away from the parliament, ladies and gentlemen, as the last answer to that question. If you take away the power of the parliament, they brought that weird analysis that there would be, I don't know, like political instability. Ladies and gentlemen, what we clearly see is that we want to further foster the true value of democracy. That we believe that you just are best capable of representing yourself. And this is just, ladies and gentlemen, that you are just much more capable of representing yourself as some lobbyistic politicians. So because what we also showed you is that lobbyism and the checks and that we would just further foster checks and balances. So ladies and gentlemen, to show you our case, what we saw is that we clearly showed you that we just fight for the true value of democracy, and we presented that well. Ladies and gentlemen, we stand for opposition.
Thank you for your speech. Now I'd like to invite the opposition to speak.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sofia Martinera, and I'm the third speaker of today's opposition team. What I'm going to do through my speech is to resume the case in my three main clashes, because I think that this debate summarizes two: necessity, power, and power. In these three main clashes, I'm going to show you the arguments that we've stated, the responses, why our arguments still stand, and why theirs don't. My first clash is about necessity. Our argument says that there's a low participation. There's a low participation from all the people in these several referendums that have been done throughout the history. Therefore, there is no necessity for them because these people don't care. The majority of the people don't care on these so-called important matters such as what they define territory or big constructions. They actually are not that much involved in these decisions that we take. So what should we spend? 120 million pounds for each one of these sovereign referendums when people are not even that interested. I mean, if there were a high percentage and the majority and the vast majority of the people actually did care, they would go and vote in these sovereign referendums. But they don't. So why spend 120 million pounds? No, thank you. For each referendum when there is no necessity for this. We're talking about taking 120 million pounds of another project from, or taking it from the economy and putting it into something that people actually don't care. I think people, this money could be so much better reinvested than doing it into referendums when there is no necessity. Yes.
So that people don't care. Could you please just give us an analysis why people don't care and just state some examples?
Well, the examples were stated by my companions actually, in a case where they did actually surrender referendums and less than 40% of the people actually did vote. So if they would have cared so much, then why just 40 out of every 100 people came out and voted? If you were really interested on that matter, you would have go and gave your opinion. But either you think that you're not qualified to give your opinion, even you don't care what these actually comes in, or you think your opinion is not important, doesn't matter. But only 40 out of 100 people came and voted, and the government actually spent 120 million in that referendum. I think that this is a waste of money. Moving on to my second question, which is about power. Who gives people give the government the power to decide for them on these important matters? That's what the parliamentary democracy is about. That's what democracy is about. This is about the representation, because people vote for another person that has a similar opinion to your own, so that they can decide on these important matters for you. Either because no thank you think you're not well qualified, or you just don't want to do it. But this work, this assignment is done by the government, no thank you. And that's why the people give this power to the government. So why take away no thank you? The power from the government when they actually have it. They also talked about a correct representation. Well, we said that there is already a correct representation when it comes, no thank you, to ideology. We're talking about politics right here. There are a lot of, no thank you. No, there are a lot of politic parties, and you vote for the person that actually has your same either political party or your same, no thank you, ideologies, so that they can decide for you. So their ideologies are already correctly represented, and this. And you also talked about that, correct? No, thank you. Correct representation will lead us to a satisfied population. Well, let me tell you that this is a populist measure. Why? Because this is why I'll answer that in my third class, which is about the heart. This is a populist measure. Why? Because the governments are only going to do the so-called sovereign referendums to correctly represent the people when they know they're going to win. Who is going to regulate that this is going to actually, no thank you, that this is actually going to happen? Who is going to regulate everything? They never stated the right mechanism. They never said which organization with what money. This is time and this is money. No thank you. Wrongly invested in something, no thank you, that people is not really that much interested in at the moment. We also gave
that for you.
Yes.
We clearly defined in our definition already on which issues we're basing this vote, and obviously this referendum is put up by the government now. So it's clearly
a lot. I get your point. Actually, in your definition, you defined important matters such as changing the constitution, things to do with, territory, and big constructions. I know that's the definition, but I'm asking, who is going to regulate this? This is a populist measure. The only thing that they're going to bring us is what we stated in our argument, which was about long-term vision versus circumstantial situation. Why? Because the people are going to be happy for the moment because they don't know the other side of the coin. They're going to give you this sovereign referendum just when they know they're going to win, and these people are not going to realize how much this may actually harm the people. No, thank you. In the long-term vision. Why? Because they are misinformed. They said that this misinformed, they actually asked a question, the third speaker of the proposition C. How is this misinformed citizen capable of voting for the expert that we think that is better qualified? Well, we actually didn't mean that the misinformation comes to every single subject of the matter. I mean, what we think is that the state or the government, that we are giving them the instance to actually manipulate this information so that you get the voters to vote for what they actually want. And they're going to be happy. No, thank you. They're going to be happy because what they voted for they actually want, but that's actually what the government exactly wants them, no thank you, to do. So they're going to be happy. They don't realize how much harm they could actually brings them, and this is going to bring a temporarily happy population, but in the long term they're going to realize how much this may actually harm them. What I've done through my speech is prove to you why our case still stands in our three main clashes: harm, necessity, and power. I've restated our arguments and rebutted what the third speaker of the proposition team just said, and I rebutted what the proposition team has said so far. Because there is no necessity, because the power is already well distributed, and because the harm clearly outweigh the benefits, I beg the judges to oppose.
Thank you for your speech. Now I'd like to invite the opposition for 5 seconds.
Okay, so what I will do during my speech, I will summarize all of the debate into three main questions. Number one is people capable to take decisions of such importance? The answer is no. Why? Because, well, it's clear. We're not assuming that people are stupid. We never said that. But people clearly don't have enough knowledge and enough capacities to know what's best for the country. That is why we choose politicians. That is why we live in a democracy. If people would be able to take all the decisions of a country, well, we wouldn't live in a democracy. And besides, not every single person knows what's best for the country and is well informed. Even though you try to inform the people, as it has been proven, a lot of people lack interest, so they may vote without the knowledge and the capacities. As we also said, they may be influenced by propaganda or the current situation, which may then lead to a problem in a few years because they took the decision that wasn't right for the country. My second question is it worth to make a referendum having all these costs and damages that it can generate? Well, no. Why? I refer that it's an expensive thing to do. And if you do it every time you have a question or an important issue, it will clearly not be worth all of the costs. Besides, as we gave an example, people don't vote in these things. And it's not only on the small city of London, which is not small, but also in many other countries. They have been proven, even in my country, only 48% of the people vote for the presidential elections, and this has been proven in many other countries. This is not enough to represent all of the majority. So why, if not even in the presidential elections people actually vote, make another decision for people to make when they clearly lack interest? Another question is, will this referendum be controlled? Of course not. As our argument said, politicians will always only make a referendum when it's in their way, or where people will vote in their what they want. And you said that politicians are not always very clear and that they may be manipulated by pharmacy or by economy. Well, that is the reason why at the same time politicians may only make a referenda when it's for their own satisfaction, for their own good. So who will be controlling the referendums are taken when people actually need it? Well, nobody. Why? Because this is a parliamentary democracy where people choose the representatives to control their country. And if they are in control, then of course they won't make referendum every time people need it. And this has been proven in the examples my companion gave. It is clear that this referendum will not be controlled. So, because these are huge issues which cannot be reduced to a yes or no question, because the citizens are not capable to make these huge decisions, because it is not worth all of the costs, the possible benefits, and because the politicians may manipulate or only make referendum when they need it, I please beg the judges to oppose.
Now I'd like to invite the governmental advisor to close the vote.
So since there's only a 48% of turnout on voting for president of Chile, then ladies and gentlemen, why shouldn't we in fact abolish the vote of the president of Chile as a whole under their model? What we see here is that they've clearly contradicted themselves in many different ways and aspects throughout this whole debate. What I have summed this debate to is in fact 3 questions, which are rather similar to what their questions were as well. And we'll first start off by analyzing what are the true values of democracy and how the sides view differently. Then I'll move on to, are citizens in fact capable of voting or the representatives better? And is it an economical burden that's worth taking? So let's start with the true values of democracy. They stated here that in representative democracy, the main thing is in fact representing in fact the population of what they think. Here we see that in a parliamentary democracy, there's that one word that's at opposition forgot today, which was democracy. So first we need to take a look at what the values of a democracy are, as my first speaker stated throughout this debate, which was a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. When we first, in fact, to preserve a representative democracy, we first need to preserve the true values of democracy, which is what we're standing for here today. We say that if we take away the representative part, we still in fact have a democracy. But if we take the true values of democracy away, then we're just left with this representative. So we say that in fact the true and the main value of representative democracy is in fact a democracy. So we must first work on doing that, on preserving that as a whole. Moving on to the second question today, which was in fact, are citizens capable of voting or the representatives better? They state that when citizens are not as qualified and are misinformed and therefore cannot vote on that. As my third speaker clearly stated, we have that one simple question. How in fact, if they're so misinformed and not capable, how in fact are they supposed to vote for the right representatives who represent them? We see that they try to answer this on somewhat of a basis saying, well, you can be still manipulated, and that in fact that the people can be manipulated easier. But we clearly stated throughout this whole debate that the representatives in fact have a higher risk of being manipulated because in fact their vote counts more in a parliament rather than the people do as a whole. We furthermore see that in fact representatives might know more, but they cannot represent you better than yourself. And that is a quick quote that I'll take from some opposition today, who said, you can vote for somebody that has a similar opinion to yours. What we see here is that has a similar opinion doesn't mean that necessarily it has the same opinion as yours. What we once again see is that if a democracy is of the people, by the people, and for the people, then it's the best if you can allow to represent yourself when it comes to the most important issues. Which leads me down to the main point in this debate. Is it actually worth all the burden? Is it actually worth the economic burden that we're taking here? They clearly stated throughout this whole entire debate, saying that no, it's not worth it because A, the people are not capable, B, they don't care about this, and C, in fact, it will be an economical burden on the society and on the economy as a whole. What we see is that based on their analogy, based on what they're stating, then we should also abolish the voting of the president in Chile because they only have a 48% turnout. We should abolish that, and in fact have no president in Chile because they do not care about what's going on, and because the people do not care about doing that. What we see is that a low turnout does not necessarily mean that we should not have a sovereign referendum. Why? Because we see that there are still people that care. We see that, in fact, those 48% do care who the president of Chile is. And we see that, as we've seen in our first and our second speech, there are people who the political participation will, in fact, rise through giving them this actual voice, ladies and gentlemen. What most people see is that they do not have a voice. So let me sum it up. When we stand here saying that a country, in fact, should take the risk, because, in fact, the citizens are capable of voting. In fact, if they're capable of voting representatives, then they're capable of representing themselves as well. We say that first, we must promote the pluralism of democracy before talking about the representative part. And then when it comes to things like constitutional changes, wars, taxes, and decisions, stuff like that, we should, in fact, enforce the sovereign referendum because it affects them directly. So for all these reasons, to preserve democracy, vote proposition.